So let's begin. This is Julie Rickert from the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I'm talking with Sandra Burge, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio. For those of you who may not know Dr. Burge, she has made a career not only as a researcher, but also helping others to overcome barriers to scholarship. In her work with the Behavioral Science Family Systems Educator Fellowship, she helped fellows develop research self-efficacy. I myself have seen research and writing as pretty intimidating, and I've benefited from Sandy's mentorship. Hopefully, everyone is ready now. Welcome, Sandy.
Thank you.
Last September at the forum, you inspired all of us to act scholarly, and then followed up with that great workshop with Alex Reed, Research as a Team Sport. And I had really good intentions of making progress in this area, and then, of course, COVID-19 hit us. I'm sure everyone is interested in any reflections you may have about the impact of the pandemic on scholarly activity.
Well, for my own self, the impact has been very light because, I'm retired now and I'm not doing any active research anymore, except I am still writing up results from years and years and years of data collection. So I reached out to some of my researcher friends and asked them, how is COVID affecting you? My friend Richard Young at John Peter Smith Hospital in Fort Worth, he wrote back and he said, this has been really good for my scholarship because he said they've decreased the number of clinics we attend. And so I have more time for writing. In contrast, I got a note from a psychologist friend of mine at the university here who sent me a cartoon. It had a little dog sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and the house was burning down around him. And the little dog, the thought bubble was, this is fine. I wrote back to her and I said, can you tell me in words how this is affecting you? And she said, well, one of her research projects has a control group that's treatment as usual, and nothing is as usual anymore. So that's how COVID can affect one's scholarly activity, either in a positive or a negative sort of way.
I know that when we were talking about this presentation, you were talking a little bit about emotional costs of the pandemic on the researcher. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, if you're getting stuck, that can have an emotional impact. And if you're concerned about your own safety and your family's safety, certainly those who are working in the healthcare setting have that emotional cost as well. Katie, my researcher friend who's in the house on fire, her aunt died recently.
Oh.
So she's also dealing with grief as well as all the other stresses that go along with not being able to do what she wants to do.
Wow. And I imagine a lot of people are dealing with things like that. What ideas do you have for listeners who may be considering a scholarly project at this time?
So this is probably not the best time for data collection unless you are studying the impact of COVID. So this is an ideal time to look at unusual circumstances and how people are managing it. So it's a perfect time to do COVID-related research. And even if you feel like you're getting a late start right now in studying COVID because you weren't collecting information at the beginning of this quarantine, the way it transitions back into our next life, I don't want to say back to normal because we may never see what we had before, but you may want to be recording and thinking about and studying how we transition back into a COVID-free life later. So that's a good thing to be studying at this time. Other options for you, if you have more time on your hands because clinics have slowed down, it's a great time to do reading, to get on your virtual library and download some stuff and build your library for your own scholarship. It's also a great time for writing. Like my friend Richard is doing lots of writing right now because his life is slowed down. But if your life is more than full and you're doing more than usual and more than you used to do, then take a break. Just take a break.
That's always good advice. Sandy, you work every year on a research boot camp. What are some of the topics you cover in this?
Oh, in fact, I'm going to do this research boot camp in about 3 weeks. So while I'm talking to you, I'm also getting ready to do that. So I'm doing basic research skills at the research boot camp. It has to do with how do you come up with a research question? How do you get started in research? How do you determine measurement, research bias, sampling? I cover different kinds of research designs, retrospective and prospective. This year, they're going to do a new program for faculty only. And there I'm going to talk about how to incorporate research and scholarly activity into your residency curriculum and meet the ACGME requirements. I also end with how to write a research paper or grant proposal. So it's a one-day workshop. It's a really full day.
Huh. I bet a lot of people would love to attend such a workshop. What could others do to implement a similar program?
So to do a research, it's kind of like how you would put together a behavioral science curriculum. To do a research curriculum in your program, you need a champion. You need somebody who's able to lead it and somebody who knows something about that. And to do this kind of boot camp, the Kettering Health System does it for 11 different medical specialties. So my audience is not just family medicine, it's people from lots of medical specialties. If you wanted to do something like this, again, find somebody who knows research and can talk about research, and also somebody who's worked with brand new researchers and knows some of the challenges of getting started and so forth. So, and you also need time to do it in space, and you need commitment from the departments to let their people go to a half day or a day long workshop for this.
Yeah, I imagine that there's some challenges to getting the proper kind of buy-in, but also making sure that you're pitching it. I was reading something really interesting about how much time does somebody estimate that it'll take for somebody to learn how to use a new iPhone, for example, for somebody who's never done it before. And the people at the store, of course, all feel like, well, this is super easy because they do it all the time. And they grossly pitch their information in a way that's not very useful to the learners. And so having somebody who knows what it's like to be kind of new and anxious and not very secure in using basic statistics or research design or writing skills, I imagine would be really useful.
We have to remember that most of our residents have not studied research until they reach residency program. So they they know they're supposed to know something about it, and they're supposed to be able to read manuscripts and interpret them for patients, but very few of them have had a statistics course or research methodology course as an undergraduate, except for maybe lab science. So the studies of humans and people and their behaviors is much less prevalent in their backgrounds.
Mm. Now, that next step, once you've maybe done a study, you have to take that next step and do the writing, or possibly you're doing some non-traditional things, whether it's a narrative or a 55-word story or poetry. Writing can be intimidating for many people, and as you know, me included. Your growth as a writer is an interesting story. Would you be willing to share that?
Well, I was a terrible writer. As a math major, as an undergraduate, and writing, I still don't love to write. So writing was hard for me. I wasn't required to do it very much as an undergraduate. I was, like I said, a math major. And as I was applying to graduate school, I had a professor already interested in me. And so he was looking over my application and he laughed at my personal statement, was so humiliated, and he wrote it himself. So I did not have a happy start with my writing career. So what I did, I just, as soon as I got a faculty position, I just went to every writing workshop I could find. Society of Teachers of Family Medicine offered writing workshops in those days. Lucy Candid led some of them, and I learned a lot from her. I also went, our faculty development center at my university had writing workshops as well. And from them, I learned how to structure a sentence so people can make their way through it and also how to structure paragraphs. I mean, just the basic stuff I should have learned as an undergraduate, but I didn't. So I also had a chairman, Barry Weiss, who at the time was editor of the Family Medicine Journal, the STFM journal. He sat down one day and said, here's how you write an introduction. It's 4 paragraphs. And it was a structure for me, writing was always just this cloud of ideas, and I didn't know how to put them together and get them on paper, and I would get stuck and befuddled. And he said, here's a structure, paragraph 1, paragraph 2, 3, 4. And I thought, I can do that. I have a strong left brain, right? I have an analytic brain. So I can do structure. And so once I figured out the structure, and it only took me, 10 or 12 years, then I felt more comfortable writing research papers after that.
In our first planning conversation, you shared ideas about first drafts that I think others would find inspiring.
Now that I've learned how to write, I've been actually doing writing workshops myself. And one of the articles I send to my learners is an article by Anne Lamott called Shitty First Drafts, where she emphasizes you don't start with the perfect product as soon as you put pen to paper or put fingers to keyboard. And so she says, I have a quote from her. This is so great. The first draft is the child's draft, where you let it all pour out and then let it romp all over the place, knowing that no one is going to see it and that you can shape it later. In the beginning, just write crap. If you can't think of anything else to write, it's really wonderful. There's a poet who also says there is no such thing as good writing, only good rewriting. And I think we all know Susan McDaniel, and she's written several books that are of a benefit to us behavioral science people in family medicine. And Susan McDaniel's mentor told her that she needs to edit stuff about 30 times, which sounds crazy, except when I think about my own writing, I probably sit down to a manuscript 30 times and go through it that many times myself. So he says to make it clean and beautiful, you need to really go through it and comb through it and comb through it and make it gorgeous. One of the frustrations and one of the things that was so hard for me in the early days is I never feel like I'm finished with writing, because you can always come through and find something else to just tinker with. If you think you have to write something perfect your first draft, you're going to get stymied. And some of the most frustrating days I've had is sitting down to write, and I have a nice 8-hour block to write, and I get one paragraph done, maybe. And it just feels so frustrating. And so Lucy Candive is the one that taught me how to get unstuck. And she says, if you're feeling stuck, just write anything. She even said, if you get stuck, just write, I don't know what to write. 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 She said, after a while, you get tired of doing that. And then your mind will kick in and become a little more creative too. One other great teacher I had was John Cleese of Monty Python fame. He was here in San Antonio one day to give a talk about creativity. And I thought, that's interesting. And so we went to his talk at a local college, and I just assumed he was going to be his goofy Monty Python self, but he was very professorial, talking about the work of writing 3-minute sketches for Monty Python. And he said they would often get stuck. They'd be working on a sketch and his team would get stuck. And at the end of the day, they didn't know how to end a sketch. So they would go home and sleep on it. He recommends sleeping on it, which, you hear writers also say, put it away for 2 or 3 days. And the answer is sometimes your subconscious works on it. Even when you're trying to push it too hard, your subconscious will continue to work on the piece and maybe help you find a way through that stuck place.
I had an experience with that recently. I was doing a spoof of the Battle of Yorktown from Hamilton and trying to put different rap terms that reflect the year 2020 onto it. And that is exactly what happened. I'd been struggling with this one area and I just wrote anything down to just get it in. And then I woke up at 4:30 in the morning with like the full phrase, exactly what I wanted.
Ta-da.
I know, it's so exciting. When your department wanted to help their faculty to develop confidence in writing, they hired a professional writer. Could you share some of the pearls of that experience?
Yes, we hired Denise for about 3 years. She was hired on one of our grants, and she was just wonderful. Her job was not to do the writing for us, but to coach us and edit our manuscripts and our grant proposals and so forth. And so she was such a gem. She was a creative writer, but to earn a living, she did technical writing with us and with others too. I think she was a half-time person. We kept pestering her to also teach us creative writing. And in that process, I learned that my colleague, Bob Ferrer, is a beautiful writer. And in fact, around that time, he wrote a narrative piece for JAMA that's called The System of No System. And he was critiquing the United States healthcare system and basically saying we don't have a system. But it was a beautiful essay. It was published about 1992 in JAMA. So that was pretty impressive writing. But Denise taught me, one of the things she taught me that I just love so much is she taught me how to enter writing, because as you know, I don't love to write. She taught me how to enter writing. And much like how you enter reading, when you sink, I love to read. I read a lot of fiction and I sink down into a book and almost like going underwater to read. You know, I'm just down there in this quiet place and I tune out everything else around me. She taught us how to do that. She called it an altered state of consciousness. She said, when you're writing, you need to also find your way to that place. And so she recommended rituals to do that. And she said, you probably already have rituals, but I just want you to embrace them and to realize that's what you need to do to get yourself in that place where you can write. So she says, if you need to play 3 games of solitaire to get started, you should do that. If you need to brew a pot of tea and pour yourself a cup of tea, you should do that. If you need to sharpen 3 pencils, even though you're writing on your computer, you should sharpen 3 pencils. And so my routine to enter writing, I set up, I make sure I have a drink. Right now I have coffee next to me. I always need to have a pad of paper next to me and a pencil next to my computer while I'm writing, because I get itchy. I want to jump up, especially if I'm getting stuck or distracted. I want to jump up and do some other little errand. And so I've started just keeping a piece of paper next to me so I write down those little errands I want to do instead of jumping up and doing them. This way I'm not going to forget to clean the kitchen or call my mother or make a doctor's appointment or whatever that little thing that I'm just jumpy and itchy to do. And it helps me settle down and settle into the writing. So those are some of my rituals for entering writing. I also like to have perfect quiet. Some people love to have music or they write with the TV on as background noise. I don't want any background noise. I'm too distractible. So I like to have a quiet place. I live alone, so I've done a lot of writing at home. If I was at the office, I would shut the door because people like to drop in at the office. And I also like to have good stretches of time to write. So I like to have a half day or a full day for writing. And some people can do it in short bits and bites. My colleague David Catterdahl is like that. His habit for writing is he comes in early in the morning. He comes in about 7 and he writes for an hour and a half and then he goes to clinic. He's a family doctor. And he does this every morning, every day. He writes a little bit every day. And because he writes a little bit every day, he never loses his place in the manuscript because it's always still fresh. So there are different ways of doing writing, and you should kind of find your own way and embrace the ritual of writing. Find your way to sink into it. I've been to a lot of writing workshops, and I've also read a lot from writers, and they also say you have to plant your butt in the chair and do the work. So you can't just wait for inspiration to find you. Actually have to just sit down and do what you can when you can, and inspiration will find you.
You have suggested that when learning to write, that we find editors who can be gently constructive. As you know, all too painfully, I took you at your word. When I got inspired to write a narrative essay, we'd been talking a lot about this particular podcast. And so I gave it a try and I spammed you with my drafts. What I want to share with participants is to be careful. I was so anxious. I shared my drafts with too many friends in an attempt to calm my anxiety and get feedback. And it was definitely a case of too many cooks in the kitchen. Different editors like different things, and it would have been a lot less stressful to go in just one direction. So that said, it was an immensely valuable experience to have other people's eyes on what I was writing. Do you have any final suggestions for our participants before we transition to the Q&A session?
I just want to remind everyone that we want to know your stuff. If you are doing something That's really great. I think my message is to let us know about it. You need to reach out to us and show us what you're doing that's working for you. Especially during COVID, this is a time when we're reinventing teaching, we're reinventing clinical work. If you've invented something that's working for you, you need to share it with all of us because we're all sort of in that same place. So please share your ideas with us. Be scholarly.
Awesome.
And I'll take a minute to summarize. COVID 19 has had varied impacts. It's disrupted treatment as usual situations while creating opportunities to look into the impacts of the pandemic and social distancing on our lives. Some may have more time to finally dig into a literature review or narrative essay, while others may be so swamped they just need to take a break. Sandy's point that she was not born a good writer gave me hope. Be willing to write poorly and then edit it, maybe 30 times to get it into a good enough state. And then don't get caught in the trap of seeking perfection. Be willing to pursue education and mentorship about writing. Discover the rituals you need to get into the flow state. Most importantly, write a lot, and then share it with others. Don't let your self-doubt prevent you from sharing your work. Your insights may be exactly what someone else needs.